Welcome back to day 42 of 100 Days of Code. Subscribe and turn on bell notifications. Now, whenever we start using a new API, the most important thing is to read the documentation. I know it's really tempting to skip over the instructions and just get right into it. I'm also the sort of person who buys a lawnmower and throws away the instruction manual. And then 2 days later something breaks and I just want to hurt myself because it would be so much easier if I had actually read the instruction manual. But in this case, it is really important. So let's head over to Open together and let's go to the API section to see the API documentation. As you can see, this API provider actually has several products. So you could look at the current weather data, the hourly forecast, the one-call API, the daily forecast, and a whole bunch of other things. So each of these have their own endpoints. And if we take a look at the API doc, you can see this first one, the API is. That's the endpoint. Whereas the hourly forecast is. So depending on what it is that we need, we can tap into each of these different APIs. Let's start off with an easy one. Let's try and get the current weather data for the city that we're in. You can see that this part is the endpoint, so the URL that we're going to tap into. And then we have some parameters. The parameter where we can specify the city name is. So that's the name of the parameter, and then we have to provide a value. Now, in addition, there's another parameter, which we have to include with all of the API calls to this particular service, and that is an APID. We have to get hold of an API key in order to use this service. And they show you an example here. If we click on this URL, it takes us to. And this is just some sample data where they provided a sample APID. Now, we can get our own APID for free by simply signing up to this weather service. And once you register and sign in, this is the page that you see. So we can now go into this section called API Keys and grab our API key here. So you can create as many keys as you want, and you can provide a name that's associated with the final usage for that key. So I've named it Python. And now I'm going to copy this API key and I'm going to place it into my project. I'm going to create an API key, and I'm going to save that key that I copied into a set of double quotes as a string. Now, once I've got my API key, I can actually test out this API call. So I can replace this part with my city name, which is London, and then I can add my country afterwards just to make sure that it goes to London, UK, and not London, Ontario, or somewhere else. And then finally, I'm going to paste in the API key that I copied over just now. And now, when I hit enter, and as long as my API key is valid, I should get a result in the format of my weather data. Now, I want you to make sure that your API key works as well by using the same method. But remember that you have to get hold of your own API key by signing up to Open Weather Map if you want this. Make sure that you replace this part with your own API key. Otherwise, it's not gonna work. Now that we've seen that this particular API call actually works, let's see what happens if we provide the wrong API key. So if I just make up an API key and hit enter, you can see we get a code back, which is an HTTP code called 401. And we can also get a message telling us that that's an invalid API key and we can go to this URL for more info. Now, remember, in previous lessons, I mentioned that HTTP status codes are the codes that we get back when we try to talk to another server. So in this case, we got the 401 code back, which means unauthorized. And when you get this code back and you're working with an API, it usually means that your API key or your way of authorizing with the API key is somehow not working. So that is the thing that you should examine. We can see that for this particular API provider, we have to authenticate ourselves with their server by providing the API key as a parameter. Now, remember, you can get your current latitude and longitude just by going to, and then typing a place name, and then clicking Find. At some point, it should show you your latitude and longitude, which you can then plug in as a parameter to this particular API call. As always, we're going to start off by importing our requests package. Import request, then, we can use the get method to pass in our endpoint. Now the Open Weather Map endpoint is the one that we see in the API docs. So it's everything up to but not including the question mark. So all of this. And we can paste that in and save it as a string. That is what we want to make our GET request to. So OWM endpoint. And in addition, we're going to provide some perms. So this is going to determine what kind of data we get back. And in this case, it's going to be the weather for a particular location that we're interested in. Let's create our weather perms, and this is going to be a dictionary. And we have to follow the keys that are provided in the API docs. So the parameters that we can provide for this API are lats, which is the latitude, lon, which is longitude. And a lot of people make typos here because they add a G. It's actually just LON. That's the name of the parameter key. And finally, the APID, which is your API key that you got earlier on. In our case, we want to provide a lat, the latitude, we want to provide a lon, LON, which is the longitude, and we also want to provide our APID. Now our APID is simple. It's simply the API key that we got earlier on. And again, just as a reminder, this key is not going to work. You'll have to register and get your own for it to work. Now the latitude we're going to figure out by using. So I'm trying to get the weather for where I currently reside, which is London. So my latitude is this value and my longitude is this value. Make sure that you copy everything, including any negative signs like this. So these are going to go in as floating point numbers. And now that we've completed our weather perms, we're going to pass it into this method. And now, we can save the output that comes from this as the response. And we can print the response.status code to see if it was successful. So now let's go ahead and run our main.py. And you can see the response code we get back is 200, which means everything is A-OK. Now, if you get a response code that's a 401, that means your API key is probably not valid, or you've misspelled the name of that key. It should be APID, all in lowercase, as they've shown us in their documentation. If you did get 200 though, that means everything was successful, and we can now tap into the actual data. So let's tap into the response.json and let's print that out. So there you have it. We've got all of the data here that came back from that API call. And if you scroll, there's actually quite a lot of data that's in there. Now, in order to view this, it's not very easy to look at it in the console. So I'm going to triple click on this and copy all of that string. And I'm going to view it in an online JSON. So I'll link to this as well, but you want to paste that JSON you got back into this and you can see, wow, what a mess. So much data. But if you click on Viewer, then you can see it has nicely formatted all of that data for us. So we can easily see the weather forecast for the next 5 days. The forecasts are every 3 hours, starting from the time you made your request. Since there are 8 individual forecasts per day for the whole 5 days, you should get back a total of 40 forecasts. At the bottom of the JSON, you'll see a location name that's closest to the latitude and longitude that you provided. For my coordinates, that's Abbeywood in London, United Kingdom. Going back to the top, I can look at the actual. If I expand the first data point here, you can see that it gives me a timestamp. This timestamp format is the number of seconds that have passed. So Open Weather Map has given us a DTTXT field as well. If you expand main, you'll see the temperature in kelvins, the pressure, the humidity, but also the actual weather. As you can see from the square brackets, the weather data comes in a list. Looking inside, we see this list has a single entry. Here's where we have our description of the weather forecast. It's telling us that the forecast is overcast clouds, which is pretty normal if you've ever been to London. At least it's not raining. We've now managed to use this Open Weather App API, authenticate ourselves with an API key, and get the required data back from this service. So in the next video, we're gonna dig into the data that we got back, and we're going to use it to figure out whether if it's gonna rain today. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next